Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to focus on setting up 3D cameras for compositions in After Effects. Now let's begin by starting with a 3D camera setup. Let's go ahead and create a new camera. And by the way to access this, the composition settings for a camera is by either right-clicking on your timeline somewhere and from the flyout menu choosing New Camera, or going under Layer, New Camera, or by using the shortcut keys Control-Alt-Shift-C on the PC or Command-Option-Shift-C on the Mac. Now, when you click on that, or when you call it that way, you open up the camera settings window, and there are two areas of focus that we need to pay attention to when we're setting up cameras. The first one is the type of camera that we want to choose, whether we want to work with a one-node camera or a two-node camera. Now, the difference between these two types of cameras is the way they orient. And one node camera orients on itself, around itself. So basically, it's almost like the pivot point of the camera is in the camera itself. A two node camera orients towards a point of interest. So it's always targeting something else. Let me cancel this out really quick here, and let me show you the difference between those two. So a one node camera will orient around itself. Like I said, it's like the pivot point is on the camera itself. So what you're looking at on the screen is basically a one node camera. That's how it would behave. A two-node camera would behave as if it was pointing to a point of interest. So it will orient around that point of interest. It will not be orienting on its own pivot point. So let me stop that for a second and go back to my previous composition. Now, which camera should you use? You might be asking yourself. Let me go ahead and open up the composition settings, the camera settings window, so that I can start working through these composition settings. Through these camera settings. Now, when you ask yourself, what should you use? Well, I always let the composition itself determine what camera I will be using. So if my composition requires that my camera is always targeting a specific point, then I will choose a two-node camera. If I need a camera that is free-flowing, almost like you want it guided by, let's say, motion paths or something like that, you want to rotate it freely, then I would use a one-node camera. The great thing about this is that, let's say, for example, you choose one-node camera, and I'm going to use everything as default for now. If I click OK on that, I have the camera created, and it appears in my composition. By the way, here's a tip. Make sure that you have at least one 3D layer set up in your composition so that the camera actually doesn't give you a prompt saying, hey, you don't have any 3D layers, but I'm going to create it anyway. So that might happen if you don't have any 3D layers. Remember, 3D layers are marked or switched by turning on that little switch here, the little cube underneath on the right-hand side of your switches window. So with the camera done, selected, say, for example, at this point, I said, oh, I created a one-node camera, but I really needed a two-node camera. Then all you need to do is either double-click the camera to open up the camera settings, or select the camera, go to Layer, Camera Settings. Either one of the two will open up the settings for the camera, or you can use the shortcut Control-Shift-Y. And that will open up that settings window, and then you can go in and make changes to the camera. It will only affect the way the camera sees the world. So if you have set up keyframes at this point, then you might have to go back and revise those keyframes. But for most purposes, you can go ahead and change it without significant change to your composition, to the composition itself. It's only the camera. It's only the way the camera is looking at the world. And if you're making those changes, it's because you need to make them. So it's time well spent. Now, the second area of importance is the presets area. So if I click on this drop down, I notice that I have a set of presets, and they are named according to the focal lengths. Each one of them is meant to represent the behavior of a real-world camera. So each camera preset has different variables. And the presets, basically, they set up different properties for that particular camera that you're creating. So by default, I have this set to 35 mil, which basically means the focal length from the actual area if this was a real camera in the real world, where my sensor is located, to the actual point in the lens where my focal point is. So basically that distance between that area and the lens is the focal length. So let's actually close this for a second. Let's just click on 35 and let's talk about what the camera settings said. So they said, as you can see here, they set the zoom value of the camera. So how far does the camera zoom? the focus distance, which is at which point of distance between my lens and my camera is the area where my camera will be completely on focus. You can also change the focal length, like I said, which is based on the preset that you have set up. And you also can change aperture values, which is basically how much aperture do you have within the actual lens. This is the amount of light that the lens allows into the camera itself. You can also set other things such as locking the zoom or enabling depth of field. Notice that if I don't have enabled depth of field on, the aperture, f-stop, and all these other things that if you have taken a photography class would understand what these are, will be, they get turned off. So if you enable depth of field, they become available to you. And we're going to talk about some of these in just a second when we talk about actually setting up the different components of the camera. So you can also change the settings for units and all these things if that's your choice. I leave everything as default because this, like I said, these are created based on real world cameras and the behavior of real world cameras. And therefore, I don't change anything so that I know that they will match whatever workflow I have with actual cameras in my hand. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the difference between the presets. The lower the number of the preset, the wider the angle of the angle of view, the field of view. The higher, the more narrow it becomes. So let's go ahead and show you guys an example. So let me switch to this composition here, and I have all these layers set up as 3D layers, and the background I have scaled up a little bit so that it is larger than my background. So with that done, let me go ahead and create a new camera in this composition. Now from this composition, I'm going to start with a 35mm camera, which is a standard camera. I'm going to go ahead and click OK on that with the settings that it is set up to right now, and you'll notice that my camera appears up here. So now with that camera settings, what I want to do is I want to change the settings. We started with 35mm. So if I go ahead and let's say, for example, switch my view to a 2-view horizontal. So we're seeing this as you see from the top view. That is the field of view of my camera. And so if I go ahead and double click the camera and switch that, let me move that and activate preview, make sure that preview, it's by default, it is activated, but it might not be. So let me switch that, make sure that that is on. I'm going to switch my field of view from 35 to 15. Watch what happens to my field of view. It gets really wide, and notice what happens on the actual area in the camera itself, what the camera is looking at, which is my active camera. It's going to reach a lot wider. It's going to reach a lot more around it, which basically means it's approaching kind of like a fisheye shot where you actually capture a lot more stuff around than you would normally capture with a lower setting on that camera. You can go even lower if you want to by clicking on custom and changing the value. Let's say, for example, and by the way, you would change it here for custom. Now let's go in the other direction. This was 35. Let's go to the 135mm. You notice how much narrower my field of view got, and it almost looks like I'm zooming in, and it's really not zooming in. What it's doing, it is focusing in a smaller, in a less wide field of view. And so that's what that change on the camera lens does, that on the preset. Basically, you either get wide angles or narrow angles, depending on what you choose. Let me click OK on that for now. And let's talk about this camera navigation, what I did here a second ago, which is basically moving around in the space to be able to see things from different points of view. If you have ever worked with 3D programs, this would be a familiar concept to you. It would be something that you've done before because you have the ability to switch the amount of views that you have in order to see the 3D space from different points of view. This would be what we call your perspective view or the actual camera view, what the camera is looking at. The other ones are what we call isometric views. So if I switch from here to, let's say, 4 views, I am seeing top, front, right. Basically, these are fake cameras that the program has created for me to see the world in an isometric perspective. No, that doesn't make sense. From an isometric point of view, perspective means the opposite of isometric. Perspective basically gives you the actual depth, and it actually gives you the distance and all this stuff. In the isometric views, everything looks flat. So, but it shows you what it looks like, and it shows you the different elements based on those fields of view. And any change that you make to the camera here will be represented under your active camera. So for example, if I switch my tool to the selection tool, I can see that my camera is here. And as you see, I'm rolling over the different axes. It's giving me the cursor is showing me the little axis upon which it is set right now. So if I click and drag here, I am moving my camera on the Z axis, as you can see. And I can move it from this perspective, from the right. So that's where these are very useful. However, you notice that you run out of real estate really fast. And so in order to avoid that, you can do one of two things. You can either use the very flexible interface to move things around, if that's one way to do it. I prefer to use the shortcut tilde key. The tilde key is the key that's right above your tab key on your keyboard or to the left of your number 1 key on the keyboard. What that does is that key shortcut maximizes whatever window happens to be under the cursor on the screen. So if I am in this window and I press the tilde key on the keyboard, my composition window gets maximized. It takes over the entire interface. If I press it again, it gets back to its normal size. If my mouse happens to be over the project window and I press the tilde key, it increases the size of that to take over the screen. If I press the tilde key again, it reduces it again to its normal size. Same thing with any window. It even applies to the different tabs. So basically anything that's under the cursor with when you press that tilde key on the keyboard will automatically increase to take over the screen. So in cases like this, I usually try to work with that key so that I see what I'm looking at in much more detail. So I gain a lot of real estate by doing that. Then I can make changes and come back to bringing back my timeline and keep working the way that you usually create your compositions. Once inside this layout, you have the ability to switch the perspective or the point of view of each one of these fields by choosing from the pop-up window what you want to see. So for the field that is the window, the plane that is active is the one that has these little blue arrows in its corners. So if I click on this one, that becomes active. If I click on this one, that becomes active, and so on. So if I want to change the view, say for example, I don't want to see this from the top, I want to see it from another angle, I can choose from this pop-up window and choose the different options to switch the camera view for that particular viewport, which makes my life easier in order to switch around and change, around and to see the composition from different angles in order for me to verify or make sure that actually what I'm seeing in the perspective viewport is actually what I intend to see. Now, if you noticed on that pop-up window, there are 3 options down at the bottom. So let me go ahead and switch my 4 views to 2 views really quick. And let me switch this view here, the top view, to one of those options down here. These give you what we call almost like a bird's eye perspective for that particular composition. So you're looking at the world from a bird's eye view. And this bird's eye view is actually very versatile. It actually allows you to do quite a lot of things, such as you can see more clearly the gizmo for moving the camera around. So you see those handles. You even see the rotate handles a lot easier. So you actually can do a lot of things from in here, from this perspective. Not only can you do all those things from this perspective, but you can also fine-tune the position itself of the bird's eye view. So you can actually orbit this viewport by pressing the Alt key on the keyboard. If I press the Alt key on the keyboard or the Option key on the Mac, and I click and drag, I can orbit my perspective for that bird's eye view to accommodate to better see what I'm working with. Now, this does not affect, as you can see, it's not affecting my actual rendering, the actual camera that I'm working with. It's actually only changing the way I see the world in that particular custom view so that I can accommodate and say, for example, if I'm not being able, like before, I had my camera out here, and when I selected the camera, I couldn't see all of the different arrows in my gizmo. So if I move it this way, I now have access to them to fine-tune either on the X, Y, and Z, or fine-tune the perspective, whatever it is that I'm trying to create. A good thing to mention at this point is that what we call the active camera, and you find the active camera by choosing where you are here and looking at what in the drop down, the pop-up window, you see. Active camera refers to the camera that is at the topmost level of your composition. What does that mean? That means that you can have as many cameras, and this is not just in a case of active camera, you can have as many cameras as you want in any composition. The beautiful thing about active camera is that it tells the program which camera to render. So if you have more than one camera, you can actually create cuts within a scene by having two more cameras overlapping each other. So let me show you an example of this. I'm going to create a quick animation for this camera here using my viewport. So I'm going to go ahead and open up its properties. For this one, I'm going to open up the position and the rotation settings. You'll notice that under rotation, I have not only my rotation values, but I have also the orientation that we talked about a few minutes ago when we were talking about setting up the types of cameras. Orientation refers to the rotation of the camera to the world, and rotation refers to the rotation of the camera onto itself. So that's the difference between orientation and rotation. Orientation is to the world, to everything that's around it in the composition. Rotation is the camera itself onto itself. So because of that, orientation can only rotate 360 degrees in any direction based on the world around you. If you think of the world around you as a sphere, and if spheres being made of circles, then you can only rotate a maximum of 360 degrees before you return to where you started. While with rotation, because it's onto yourself, you're only focused on yourself, you can keep on rotating as many times as you want. So that is the difference between those two things. Let me go ahead and set up a couple of quick keyframes for position and rotation. Let's use orientation for this one. And I am going to go to about 3 seconds, and I'm going to use my arrows here to move my camera in and perhaps rotate a little bit. Try to rotate ever so slightly so my motion is looking like this. Now that's nothing fantastic, but it will show you what I refer to as setting up different cameras. So let me go ahead and bring in the endpoint for that camera to the 1 second mark. And you'll notice that my camera here, there's no camera, but if I create a new camera, and I'm going to place that camera right below it. And that camera is going to stay, actually it's just going to do a quick zoom. So let me go ahead and open up its position, not a zoom, a truck. Trucking effect is moving the camera in. Zooming is actually using the zoom in the camera itself, in the camera lens. Trucking means you are actually rolling the camera towards the subject, and that's what I want to do. So I want to go ahead and truck this in, and I want to truck it in to about 4 seconds. I want to truck it in. Let me bring in the out point of my previous camera to up here. And let me go all the way to 4 seconds on the previous camera and truck it in on the Z-axis to about, that's too much, about there, let's say. So it's nothing fantastic. So you'll notice that my camera is rolling as it starts. Watch the preview, and then it cuts to the other camera, as you see. So you can have, let me actually maybe move this in a little bit more. At this point, I want to have it a little bit closer. So you can see that my camera changes, and then I have another camera. The camera that is right underneath becomes the active camera. So the active camera is whatever camera is right underneath the time marker. At this point, the topmost camera is this one, so we do a cut to that particular camera. And this is the way, and it becomes more evident if I, for example, were to rotate this guy a little bit more this way. So you actually see the camera from different angles, the scene from different angles. And that would be the way to work camera cuts within a composition without having to create a whole bunch of compositions. So that is a good tip to know. Now, let's talk about, now that I started creating keyframes, let's talk about camera control. So to control the 3D camera, we have many options in order. I did this through position, orientation, and all that jazz. Let me delete these two cameras and create a new camera so we can see what the camera controls offer us. I'm going to create a brand new camera, 35 mils, same settings as what I had before, one node camera. Now to control a camera, you want to go ahead and use these set of tools here. This, and this. Those three tools are your orbit tools, your pan tools, and your trucking tools or dollying tools. Now, what do these tools do? Well, if I choose to orbit my camera, by the way, the shortcut to access any of those three is the C key on the keyboard, C as in camera. So if I press the C key, it will by default choose, it will loop through them. If I keep on pressing C, it will loop through all of them. So if you choose the orbit camera tool, that's what the word says is what it does. Basically, it allows me to orbit my camera around its pivot point. So as you can see on the custom view one, the bird's eye view on the left, you see what the camera is doing as I am orbiting it on the active camera viewport. Let me undo that. Now let me switch to the pan tool. If I pan, I can move my camera left and right, up or down. That is called panning the camera. So I have a camera pan ability. Trucking or dollying is the ability to push the camera into or far from the scene. As you can see, I am trucking in, trucking out. Now, there are options under these camera settings, and these are new. So if you've used After Effects in the past, this is new to the program. Each one of these now has separate options based on several things, including orbiting around the scene, which is the default that we knew in the past. Then there's orbit around the cursor tool, which is where you click. So it will orbit based on where you click on the scene, and orbit around the camera point of interest if you have a point of interest on the actual scene. So you have the ability to orbit those things differently now. They all apply also for panning. So if I can pan from under the cursor tool, so if I click and drag, that's the panning point that it's focusing on, or I can go ahead and choose pan under the point of interest if I had a point of interest based on my camera setting. And it becomes more evident when you use the dolly option. So let me go ahead and dolly towards or away. So that's dollying. But if you notice when I clicked, I see the little plus sign. That little plus sign indicates where my point of interest for dollying is based where I click. So if I want to dolly towards the gate, I click on the gate, and that's where my camera is going to go. If I want to focus on this ghost, that's where it's going to go. So that is what those subsettings do for your camera that we didn't have in the past. So it's something new to the program, and it's actually extremely useful because you can switch through them quickly. Not only that, but they actually behave almost like a 3 mouse button behaves in a 3D program. So you can actually, while pressing the Alt key, you can actually use your left mouse to orbit. You can use your middle mouse to pan, and you can use your right mouse to truck. You have those abilities now as well. So the mouse behaves like it does in a 3D program. If you have worked with 3D programs and you find that easy to work with into your workflow, that's one good thing to keep in mind, that you can work the same way over here. Make sure that you just use the modifier key Alt on your keyboard. So as you saw a second ago, we basically can animate camera properties just like we can with any layer in a 3D composition in After Effects. To set keyframes, you literally just do the same thing. You just set the stopwatch, and then you start creating more, 2 or more keyframes that will determine the motion or the changes on the actual camera. So for example, we can keyframe rotation properties by selecting the camera and pressing the R key on the keyboard, and that will actually open up the rotation orientation values for the camera. You can emulate by setting up the different things, the different settings. You can literally mimic the way a camera behaves in the real world. So what does that mean? Well, the techniques for camera motion include, let me go ahead and use my custom view so you can see what these things do. If I was going to create a tilt, I would use the rotation on the x-axis. So notice what the camera is doing on the custom view here. Let me actually switch that to my custom view to the left view so you can see. And let me zoom out slightly. So if I do that, this is what we call a tilt. Okay, that is a tilt. A pan would be if I'm looking at the camera. Let me switch it to the top view. If I rotate the camera from left to right, that is what we call panning the camera. Zooming means you actually change the zoom value of the camera. So it's not actually moving the camera towards the subject. Moving the camera towards the subject is what we call trucking. So trucking would be to move the camera, rolling the camera in or out, away from. That's called trucking, as in a truck. It's a regular truck. And You can also call it dollying the camera. With that in mind, dollying in our case, to define it as a different thing, would be to move the camera setup entirely left and right. Notice that this is different than panning. If I pan the camera, I am rotating the camera to show the entire subject, and you see how it gets basically the perspective of the subject changes. Well, with dollying, I am dollying the camera left and right. The subject remains without the distortion of perspective. You can also do something called pedestal. Let me switch my view here from top to left. Pedestal motion is basically dollying up or down. That's what pedestal motion is. So when you move this way, that's called pedestal. Okay, so those are the different settings, and you can keyframe any of those settings because they refer to the position, rotation, and orientation of the camera itself. A good thing to mention at this point is that you can actually switch, like I said, you can switch position and or rotation of a camera to create those camera motions to make them look like cameras in the real world. But you notice that X, Y, and Z rotations are separate, yet for position, we don't have those values. If you want to have those values as separate properties for the camera, and this, by the way, applies to any camera, to any 3D camera, or to any layer, you can actually go ahead and select the position, right-click it, and from the flyout menu, separate the dimensions so that you have X, Y, and Z positions as separate properties. That gives you a lot more control over how your camera behaves on the screen. You notice that it bites off a lot of real estate again, but it gives you a lot more control. So you start almost digging into the different properties of the camera so that you can actually affect the camera in a way that you intend. So it's a lot more control, a lot more granular control. Now, when I create, let me switch my viewport here from left to top. Let me do a quick change. So I'm going to go ahead and change. Let me undo the camera position. I'm just going to go ahead and create a keyframe here. And then I'm going to move my camera, my time marker to 3 seconds, and I'm going to switch my position to here and to here. So nothing fantastic. I'm just doing a little quick change in position of the camera. Camera strucking in towards the left side and dollying towards there. So basically my camera is dollying in that direction. Now to do that, when I do that, you'll notice that I create what we know to be a motion path. So if I want to change the motion path that I've created, I can go ahead and choose from my, just like with any motion path in other layers, I can choose my pen tool from the drop-down menu, and I can use the Convert Vertex tool. If I click on that tool and I click on any of the keyframes on my motion path, you will notice that they turn into Bezier handles so that I can actually fine-tune the motion of my camera to be a lot more interesting than simply having the linear camera that I was given before. So that's one. You can actually copy and paste paths from other programs like Illustrator and so on, or motion paths from other layers into this. There will be a separate video on how to do that because you need to do a couple of things in order for the 2D path, which is what comes from a vector program like Illustrator, to be recognized as a 3D path inside After Effects. So, or at least for a 3D layer. So what we want to do at this point is basically show that we actually have control over these layers just like we do with any other layers. So the path itself works the same way as it did when we created motion paths in other layers. So we can actually select the position path and go under animation, keyframe assistant, sorry, not that one, layer, transform, auto orient. So if we do that, we can actually auto orient the camera. In this case, because it's a 1-node camera, we can do this. If this was a 2-node camera, we couldn't do orient towards point of interest. It would always be pointing to a point of interest, but we could do that if it was a 2-node camera. Since this is a 1-node camera, we can orient it along the path, and you'll notice that the camera starts curving following the path, creating a more interesting motion on the camera. You can also, let me undo that really quick so that I can see my camera moving. I can also right-click any of the keyframes and change their interpolation or ECE's values so that I can create more natural motion in those keyframes. ECE's out, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. So it doesn't start suddenly. It is not a jarring motion. It just smooths into the motion and then slows down as it goes towards the end. So all of these different settings for keyframes apply to cameras just like they do to any layer that we're animating. Another property to keep in mind when we're working with cameras is to make sure that we set up motion blur for the different layers that we're working with so that the camera actually does recognize the motion blur. So if I activate that, you will notice that motion blur, it's barely visible, especially because my motion is fairly smooth right now. But if I had that activated, that motion blur activated for the layers, then the camera will recognize it. Now, if you want to increase the amount of motion blur that you're affecting, you're using on the composition to increase or decrease the value of it, you can always go to the composition settings and change under the advanced tab the amount of shutter angle and shutter phase. All of these have to do with the amount of blur that the actual cameras present on the composition. Now, these values that you see here are natural values. This is the way the cameras are intended to see the world. But if you increase these values, you will increase the value of blur on the actual composition. So know that that is something that you can control. You can control things at that much of a granular level. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the actual camera options, the things that are within the camera itself in the layer. So if I click and if I uncollapse that window, you'll notice that under transform, I have something called camera options. And they all refer to different things depending on the camera that you've chosen. So in our case, we actually have them all, and depending on the settings is what I meant to say. So because, let me double click the camera to open its settings, because I had enabled depth of field, and by the way, depth of field is not enabled by default. But you enable depth of field, then two things happen. You actually start creating a lot more control over the camera, mimicking more of a real world camera, number one. Number two, you increase your rendering time. In reality, we always want to have depth of field enabled if we want to create that natural look to the cameras. So we expect the rendering time to be increased. That is not something that works against us. It's something that we expect. So with that enabled, let me go ahead and click OK to see all of the different options for the camera. The first one, the zoom, is just like a real camera zoom. So it makes the images appear closer to the camera. So if I increase that value, basically I'm zooming just like I would with a camera. I am not trucking in. You'll notice that my camera did not move in my composition here. Basically what happened is my field of view got narrower. That's all it did. So zooming refers to the field of view. Increasing it narrows my field of view. One thing to keep it to mention at this point is that let me go ahead and reset my camera position, my camera settings, all of my camera settings. I'm going to go ahead and go to the position. I'm going to turn off all of my keyframes. Let me, by the way, when I reset, it turned into a 2-point camera, 2-node camera. You see now I have a point of interest, which I didn't have before. Let me double click that to make it a 1-node camera, and you'll notice that the point of interest disappears. And so I reset everything else. I don't have any keyframes on this camera. Now, the reason why I did that is because I wanted to show you something that happened, two values that are coordinated. When the camera is created by default, the Z position of the camera is this, -1244.4. That is the value of any camera that you create by default on the Z axis. You will notice that by default, obviously depending on the type of camera that you choose, the zoom value will match that particular position. So in this case, -1244 matches -1244, which means my zoom value is exactly the same as the Z value of my camera. There's a reason for that. Let's keep on going down on keep that in mind for just a second. As a matter of fact, let me make it a little bit, actually, let's do one thing. Let's switch to another composition and let's go ahead and create a camera for this composition. I'm going to do the same settings as I had before. 1-node, click OK, boom. Let me open up its camera settings, and you'll notice that by default it gave me the value that I had for zoom. So if I go over here to position, you'll notice that that's 1244. If I look at the camera zoom, it's 1244. The Z value is -1244. That means it's towards us, based on the actual composition. So the camera is being moved towards us at at a value of negative 1244.4 pixels. My zoom value is 1244. Depth of field has been enabled, so that's fine. So zoom lets me zoom in and out. By the way, these two guys, the lime green, these two are solids that I created. Remember, a solid is just a rectangle of color. A raster-based rectangle that you create for placeholders or for backgrounds or whatnot. And to create a solid, you simply right-click, new, solid, or go layer, new, solid. And then you define what you want, color, size, and so on for the solids that you're creating. These are not vector-based. These are raster-based. Remember that. Vector-based would be shapes. So this solid back here, its position on the z-axis is at 0. While this one here, its position is at 1000, which means this is pushed into space, far away from us, from the camera, by 1000 pixels. So let's do a couple of changes to my camera position and camera options. So under camera transformation, I'm going to change my value for my camera to negative 1000 on the z-axis. And I'm going to change my zoom value to 1000. Okay, so now I know, basically I went back to where I was. Now I know that my positions and values for the distance to the objects are based on what I have set up here. So if my position for my camera is negative 1000, my zoom value is at 1000, I'm looking at everything as the camera intended for me to see it to start with. Now let's start working with these other settings here. Depth of field brings the image pixels basically in and out of focus. That's what gives us that nice look at, if things are far from the camera, they turn blurry. If they are close to the camera or too close to the focal point of the camera, they basically become unfocused. So that gives us that ability to create depth of field on cameras. So to enable the depth of field, you need to make sure that this is on. We have activated it on in the camera settings. Okay. So if it's off when you start, then you can turn it on from here by clicking on that. Basically, that's all you have to do, just turn it on. And make sure that you start working now with the focal distance and the aperture. These are the two settings that will start working to create that sensation of depth of field. Now, to create depth of field on a composition in After Effects, you need to make sure that you are under the classic 3D renderer. So there are two types of renders with this version of After Effects. Classic 3D is the default, and by the way, I clicked on that to open up the composition settings, or you can also open up the composition settings and go to the third tab, the 3D renderer tab, and that's where you will choose from the dropdown which one of the two renderers you're working with. Classic 3D contains a set of settings that is the standard for the program, which works really well, but sometimes we want to bring in items from other 3D programs such as 3ds Max, Maya, or Cinema 4D as 3D layers into After Effects. For those layers to render appropriately and to take advantage of workflows that actually connect to those programs, we should choose Cinema 4D. Now, doing that enables certain things on my composition that are based on 3D environments. But it disables a whole bunch of other things, such as motion blur, light transmission, and things such as mainly our camera depth of field, as you can see at the bottom of the list. So that's why you need to work with the 3D, classic 3D environment. So if you activate this and it's not happening, go take a look at your renderer. Chances are that you are working on the Cinema 4D renderer. Now, by default, the program will be under classic 3D renderer, and we will only change to Cinema 4D when we start working on bringing in 3D elements into the program. So with that done, let's go ahead and cancel this really quick. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and start playing around with these settings for the focal distance and the aperture. So as I said a second ago, the focal distance is the area where an object at a distance of that focus distance from the camera will be in full focus. Anything else before or closer to us or further away from that focal point should start getting blurry based on how far away they are from the focal point. So how does this work? Well, but this is the default value for focal distance. Right now, my focal distance for my camera is at 17.8 pixels, and my aperture is only 17.7 pixels. So that's a very low aperture, meaning anything will be in focus based on that value. This also tells me that anything that is at this distance will be in full focus. So in order to actually exaggerate or to increase that focal depth of field, what we want to do is two things. First thing is we want to increase the aperture. So let me increase that aperture from 17 to about 150, let's say. And you'll notice that my rectangle that's closer to me, that solid that's closer to me, starts to get blurry. Let me exaggerate it. Let me make it 300 so we can make the point. So you see that the thing just got completely blurry. The background one is starting to get blurry, but not as much. And the reason for that is because the background here, this one is at 1,000 pixels of distance, which means that based on the position of my camera, which was at negative 1,000, my focal point would be, if this value here is 1700 or almost 1800 pixels, then that means I am at 1000 plus that. That means 2800 pixels of distance from my camera. Since this one is at 1000 pixels in the positive, that means that that is at about 2000 distance from my camera, meaning that my focal point it's at 1800. This guy here is 2000 pixels away from the camera. Therefore, that is almost on focus. This is at 0. The value for position for this solid is at 0, meaning that its focal distance it is 800 pixels closer to the camera. Therefore, it gets really blurry. So if I want this one to be in focus and I want that one to be blurry, I need to change my focal distance to where this would be. Since my camera is at negative 1000, then the focal point to get this one in focus should be 1000 pixels. So if I change that value, the focal distance to 1000, that solid becomes blurry, becomes sharp, and the background becomes blurry. I know that this one back here is at 1000 pixels. Therefore, it would be at a distance of 2000 pixels from my camera. So let's change the focal point to 2000, 2000. And that one becomes focused while this one becomes blurry because it is closer to the camera. So like I said, anything past the focal point or closer to the focal point will automatically start to get blurry depending on how far it is and depending on the aperture that I have. So let me bring that back to 1000 so that we can see this one in focus and the one that is in the distance to be blurry. The amount of blur is the blur level that we apply to this blurriness. Now, a default camera has a blur value of 100%, but if you can increase that to more if you want to exaggerate it. So it's completely up to you. Iris shape refers to the iris. The iris shape refers to the iris of the actual lens. You can change this from fast rectangle to other options, just like you would in a professional lens. In the real world, my advice is never to change it. Keep it on fast rectangle. Anytime I change to any of these values, it gives me really interesting effects, but it renders really slow. It starts rendering really slow. So you get really cool things, and if you have the time to render, then go ahead and play around with them. But honestly speaking, every time I use 3D cameras in After Effects, I maintain things through fast rectangle. All of these settings, rotation, roundness, aspect ratio, all of that, and diffraction fringe refer to the way the iris sees, the camera sees the actual shape, sees the environment. And you can go ahead and play with those settings. They literally just work with things like moire and things like that in order to create effects. You probably have seen shots where you see round, blurry lights on a street light, for example, and then they change into stars or they change it to rectangles. That's what these settings change. Basically, they control that. And highlights, gain, threshold, and saturation have to do with boosting the luminosity of out of focus pixels. Okay, so my advice is that if you want to play with those settings, you're more than welcome to do so, and they might give you results, interesting results, but know that changing any of those settings will increase the rendering time significantly, so be careful with that. Another thing that you might want to keep in mind is that all of these settings for camera settings, they're all keyframeable, number one. Number two, they can also be controlled by expressions. And we're probably going to talk about a little bit more about expressions when we start working with actual cameras and compositions. But know that these expressions for camera settings, actually, you have access to standard expressions by going under Layer, Camera, and adding from these three options where you can either link distance to the point of interest if you want to have a specific point of interest to the camera, link focus distance to a layer, which basically creates autofocus for the camera, and set focus distance to a layer, which is basically the reverse. So you can go ahead and choose from those settings for adding expressions to cameras. So this is a short introduction to camera environments and how to control the different options for cameras. Let's put them to use in our compositions.